Okay, good morning. Today I'll be continuing on with the readings and on the theme of the Kruba Ajahns, the Thai forest meditation masters. We've done a lot of readings over the past few weeks, presenting more of the formal teachings of the Kruba Ajahns, and so for this week I wanted to just shift the focus just a little bit and actually read from the life stories, the biographies of the Kruba Ajahns, because I've always found this to be incredibly inspiring for myself. So for the next few days, I'll be reading from this really incredible book called Forest Recollections, Wandering Monks in 20th-Century Thailand by Kamala Tiyavanich. And this is just a really wonderful book that follows the lives of 10 of the most famous Thai Kruba Ajahns over the past century, and one of which is Ajahn Chah, and just tells a lot of stories about the different struggles that they had to go through on their way to becoming great meditation masters. So I'll first just begin with a little bit from the introduction to this book. During the first half of the 20th century, the forests of Thailand, or Siam as it used to be called, were home to numerous ascetic monks. The Thai term for such monks is Prat Tudong, ascetic wandering monk, or Prat Tudong Kamatan, wandering ascetic meditator monk. A Tudong monk is one who observes at least some of the 13 ascetic practices mentioned in the Buddha's discourses, in particular the practice of eating only one meal per day, sleeping outdoors in a forest or a cemetery, and being content with the very fewest possessions. In this book, I focus on 10 monks of the lineage that starts with Ajahn Mun Buridato, Ajahn Mun himself, Ajahn Wayne, Ajahn Dun, Ajahn Fun, Ajahn Tate, Ajahn Lee, Ajahn La, Ajahn Cha, Ajahn Juan, and Ajahn Wan. Although these monks were born and raised in farming communities and followed a 2 millennia old religious calling, their teachings are still relevant to present-day societies. Their teachings came from personal experiences or directly from their teachers. They were Buddhists, of course, but their brand of Buddhism was not a copy of the norms or practices preserved in doctrinal texts. Their Buddhism found expression in the acts of daily life, walking for days in the wilderness, meeting with villagers who were sometimes supportive, sometimes suspicious, spending the nights in an umbrella tent beneath a tree, in a crude shelter or in a cave, and contending with all sorts of mental and physical challenges. Their lives are worth knowing about and worth hearing as directly as possible, with as much detail as we need to understand them, for it was in their attention to details, no less than in their high purposes, that these monks' lives were exemplary. And now I will read from the chapter on facing fear. During the first half of the 20th century, the north and northeast of Thailand were sparsely populated. Paved roads were few. Vast tracts of the land were covered by forests that were home to elephants, tigers, clouded leopards, black panthers, bears, wild buffaloes, gaurs, bantangs, boars, and snakes. These animals ruled not only the wilderness, but also the fears and fantasies dwelling in every monk's and villager's imagination. As Ajahn Mun told his disciples, until a monk actually faces these animals, he will never know how much or how little he fears them. In the north and northeast, too, spirit worship was a major part of the indigenous culture. Fear of ghosts was so ingrained that it remained intact even after young men entered the monkhood. If one wanted to live a Tudong Kamatana life and work towards spiritual liberation, the fear of ghosts and of wandering alone in the forest needed to be rooted out. One of the 13 Tudong practices requires that practitioners stay in the forest for prolonged periods of time. and this practice was observed by all 10 Tudong monks discussed here. For all of them, advancing along the path of Dhamma meant developing the mind. Since fear discourages the aspirant and dissuades him from seeking seclusion, staying in the wild was a proven method for reducing and eventually eliminating this kilesa, defilement. The deep forest and the forest cemetery were thus training grounds for the Tudong monk, who saw himself as a warrior battling the unwholesome forces inside for the sake of spiritual liberation. To survive, the monk had to rely on his individual skill, experience, and knowledge, although karma also had its part to play. And this first section is on tigers. The tiger occupies a conspicuous place in the monks' accounts of their life in the forest. The monks regarded this animal with a mixture of fear and respect. Fear of tigers and the vivid imagining of oneself being devoured by tigers often drove the mind to one-pointed samadhi, concentration. Samadhi, a Tudong master explains, quote, is a gathering of the mind's energies so that they have great strength, able to uproot attachments and to cleanse the mind so that it is, for the moment, bright and clear. Any of the 40 meditation methods that the Buddha taught could, if practiced seriously, bring the mind to samadhi. The chosen meditation practice varied according to the temperaments of teachers and disciples. The concentration method that Ajahn Mun taught his disciples was the recitation of the mantra Bhutto. In the early stage of his training, a monk or novice stayed with his teacher. He participated in daily rituals, received instruction, and learned by observing. During the stage, the disciples depended on the teacher for inner guidance. If a monk was afraid of tigers, Ajahn Mun sometimes put him deep into the forest at some distance from the other monks. At night, when fear attacked his mind, a monk would force himself to do walking meditation in the open. Each monk slept on a platform built by villagers high enough off the ground to discourage tigers from leaping on them. Tudong masters believed that this method of learning the Dhamma was far more difficult than studying scriptures. In the wilds, a student had to be ever cautious of lurking dangers, which forced him to be constantly alert. He was defenseless except for his mind, which could fix itself on a theme of meditation or a recitation of Bhutto, until, as Ajahn Mun said, the mind became absorbed in Dhamma. Ajahn Mun's theory was that at such a critical moment, strong concentration would develop or deepen, and further wisdom or insight would occur. In the battle between fear and Dhamma, as Ajahn Mun's biographer observes, quote, if the fear is defeated, the mind will be overwhelmed by courage and enjoy profound inner peace. If fear is the victor, it will multiply itself rapidly and prodigiously. The whole body will be enveloped by both perspiring heat and a chilling cold. By the desire to pass urine and to defecate, the monk will be suffocated by fear and will look more like a dying than a living man. In their second stage of training, a monk wandered with other monks or novices and practiced the meditation method learned from the master. Living in the forest, monks developed finely tuned senses and became experts in using their eyes, ears, and nose. Some of Ajahn Fun's and Ajahn Chah's experiences illustrate how the monks dealt with their fear when they heard, glimpsed, or encountered tigers, and how each situation served as an exercise in mindfulness and concentration. During his 4th year of wandering, Ajahn Fun took his nephew, a novice, along with him. One day, as they were walking along a forest trail parallel to the Mekong River, Ajahn Fun spotted tiger tracks and droppings, some of them recent. As dusk was falling, they heard the snarling and growling of tigers ahead of and behind them. To keep calm, Ajahn Fun and the novice meditated while walking, but they were disturbed and had difficulty concentrating. They were afraid that the tiger would attack at any moment. To boost his courage, Ajahn Fun recited an old saying, quote, should a tiger kill cattle, it's no big news, but should it devour a villager or a Tudong monk, the news spreads far and wide. The recitation made him feel brave. He was ready to face any kind of danger. He thought, a monk who is afraid of wild animals is not an authentic Tudong monk. He reassured his nephew, quote, when we have mindfulness, the mind is at peace. It's not afraid of danger. Even if we're devoured by a tiger, we will not suffer. As it turned out, Ajahn Mun and the novice saw no tigers on this trip. Some monks deliberately put themselves into risky situations to learn about the mind. While wandering with a fellow monk and young boys on a forested mountain, Ajahn Chah remembered an old saying, quote, "When in a forest, do not sleep on a trail." He thought about this and decided to test it out. That night he set up his glot, which is a umbrella, kind of umbrella tent that the monks carry, where they suspend a mosquito net from the umbrella and makes kind of like a tent. That night he set up his glot on a forest track. The other monk set up his glot away from the trail, while the two young disciples agreed to stay halfway between them. They all sat in meditation for a while before they retired to their glots for the night. Ajahn Chah, concerned that the boys might be scared, raised his mosquito net over the top of his glot so that they could see him from where they lay. Then he lay down on the track with the mosquito net suspended above him. Off the path behind him was the wilderness, ahead of him was the village. Such a dangerous situation provides the monk with an opportunity to contemplate whatever takes place in his own mind. While Ajahn Chah was concentrating on his breath before falling asleep, he heard leaves rustling. Quote, "Slowly the animal stalked closer and closer until I could hear its breathing. In that moment, the chitta, mind, told me, a tiger is coming. It couldn't possibly be another animal. The way it walked and the breathing gave it away. Knowing that it was indeed a tiger, I couldn't help thinking about death. In that instant, the chitta told me not to worry. Even if the tiger doesn't kill you, you're going to die anyway. It's more meaningful to die for the Dhamma. I'm ready to become a tiger's meal. If we are bound to one another through karma, let it kill me. But if we aren't karmically connected, it won't harm me." With this in mind, I took refuge in the Triple Gem. Having done so, the mind was free from worrying. As it turned out, the tiger stopped pacing. I heard only its breath, about 6 meters away. While lying there, I listened carefully. Who knows, it might be thinking, who is sleeping on my track? After a while, it moved off. Its footfalls became fainter and fainter until the forest fell silent. This account reflects Ajahn Chah's firm belief in karma, which kept him calm and possibly saved his life. From this incident, Ajahn Chah learned that once he let go of attachment to life, he was no longer afraid of death and was able to remain calm. He also learned that it sometimes makes sense to heed old sayings. If a monk continued to lean on the teacher, on a friend, or on a group, he would never become wise. In his third stage of training, the monk wandered by himself, living alone on a mountain, in a cave, or under a tree in a forest. At times, the Tudong monk might end up being alone, not by his own choice, but by force of circumstance. This is what happened to Ajahn Mun. In 1925, Ajahn Mun traveled to Prapat Buabok, the Buddha's footprint, at Buabok, a hill in Udon Thani, to meet 2 other Tudong monks. But when he reached Pakbung village at the foot of the hill, the 2 had already left. So Ajahn Mun spent the next 5 days meditating alone on the mountain. One day, while walking uphill, he was startled by an unusual noise. It sounded like a big animal digging in the ground. As the thought of a tiger entered his mind, he froze. Although the encounter was sudden, Ajahn Mun's quick reaction indicates his strong mindfulness. Within seconds, he concentrated his mind so it wouldn't react to the situation. The animal raised its head out of the thick brush. It's a tiger, all right, he thought, and judging from the size of its head, it must be huge. Seeing the tiger, he felt a chill run up his spine. Sweat broke out on his face. Intuitively, he knew that if he turned his back and started running, he would be killed. The tiger would certainly attack him. So he focused his mind to face the critical situation calmly, even though his breathing was not as relaxed as usual. The tiger took one glance at him, gave a loud growl, and leapt into the forest. In the early decades of this century, villagers who lived in or near the forests accepted the presence of tigers as natural and inevitable. Accounts left by Ajahn Tate, Ajahn Lee, and Ajahn Chop illustrate the extent to which the tiger once dominated the hearts and minds of Tudong monks as well as villagers. In late 1936, Ajahn Tate spent a meditation retreat by himself near a Lahu village on a mountain in northern Siam. He was about 34 years old then and had been wandering in the wilds for many years. Hearing a tiger's growl was nothing new, but this time, alone in a hut outside the village, he was stricken with fear. He could neither sleep nor focus his mind in meditation. He heard villagers fire a shot into the air, and he saw them throw firebrands at the tiger, but the animal was undeterred. It showed no fear of humans. After retreating for a while, it came back at the crack of dawn and sat on the trail used by the villagers. When the villagers spotted the tiger, they all fled. The tiger did not pursue them, however. Ajahn Tate, who admitted that he had had a nervous disorder since childhood, remembers how frightened he was. Quote, "I sat down to meditate, but my mind wouldn't focus. At the time, I did not know that the mind was terrified of the tiger. My body sweated so much that perspiration streamed down. Why all the sweating when it was so cold? I spread the robe and kept covered, but the body kept trembling. The mind was too exhausted to meditate. I thought of lying down for a while before trying to meditate again. When I was about to recline, the tiger roared again. I was shaking as if I had a jungle fever. Only then did I realize that the mind refused to focus out of sheer fright. Immediately I sat up and cajoled my mind to have courage to face death if it came. Then the mind became calm. I no longer heard the sound of the tiger. At times when hearing the tiger again, my mind simply ignored its roar. Like the wind making contact with an object, it's just noise." Ajahn Tate's experience confirmed Ajahn Mun's belief that living among tigers and hearing them roar nearby was the best thing that could happen to a Tudong monk. Ajahn Mun meant that monks who were frightened of tigers or other wild animals had not yet realized the truth of the Dhamma. Fright was the response of the ordinary, untrained mind, while the mind with knowledge and insight into the Four Noble Truths knows the tiger's growl as simply sound. As Ajahn Chah explains, quote, "The sound arises and we simply note it. This is called truly knowing the arising of sense objects. If we develop Buddho, clearly realizing the sound is sound, then it does not frighten us. It's just sound. The mind lets go." For the Tudong monks, the clear and penetrative knowing of Buddho indicated an awakened knowledge. Ajahn Mun often sent young disciples out alone so they could realize Buddho. In 1932, at the age of 26, Ajahn Lee was sent to meditate alone on Thumb Mountain in Lamphun province. Local people believed that a fierce spirit inhabited the summit. Though afraid, Ajahn Lee forced himself to climb the mountain. On his way to the top, he stopped at an abandoned temple and stayed there for 2 nights. Like Ajahn Tate, Ajahn Lee recalls how fear could drive the mind into deep samadhi. Quote, "People had told me that whenever the lunar Sabbath came around, a bright light would often appear there. It was deep in the forest, though, and the forest was full of elephants and tigers. I walked in alone, feeling both brave and scared, but confident in the power of the Dhamma and of my teacher. The first night, nothing happened. The second night, at about 1 or 2 in the morning, a tiger came, which meant that I didn't get any sleep the whole night. I sat in meditation, scared stiff, while the tiger walked around and around my glot. My body felt all frozen and numb. I started chanting, and the words came out like running water. All the old chants I had forgotten now came back to me, thanks both to my fear and to my ability to keep my mind under control. I sat like this from 2 until 5 a.m., when the tiger finally left. In the morning, Ajahn Lee went for alms in a settlement consisting of 2 houses. A man working in his garden told him that a tiger had killed one of his oxen the night before. Having lived in the wilds for so long, Ajahn Tate also knew that a tiger could attack massive animals like a gaur or a large deer. In 1937, when he was spending a meditation retreat near a Lahu village, his strong mindfulness enabled him to see how unyielding a tiger could be. Quote, "One night a tiger came to attack a buffalo near my kuti. I banged a piece of wood and shouted loudly to chase the tiger away, but the tiger wouldn't let go, and it managed to drag the buffalo away. This time I wasn't frightened, but I dared not step out to rescue the buffalo for fear of being eaten too." Sometimes a wandering monk deliberately put himself in a risky position by traveling at night. One such monk was Ajahn Chah, considered by his fellow monks to be the most adventurous. Walking alone through a forest forced him to be constantly alert and aware. He often ran into nocturnal tigers on the prowl. Once, while wandering in northern Siam, Ajahn Chop set out in the direction of Lomsak in Phetchabun province. Approaching the great forest one afternoon, he met some villagers who invited him to spend the night in their village and continue his journey the following morning. Concerned for his safety, they warned him that the forest was large and that ferocious tigers inhabited it. If he entered it that afternoon, night would catch him there. Tigers had killed travelers who had spent the night in the forest, they said. But despite their advice and concern, Ajahn Chop insisted on going. Like Ajahn Chop believed that if he became a tiger's meal, then that was his karma, and he told the village folk so. Traveling alone, Ajahn Chop was able to take acute notice of his environment. He had not gone far when he came across tiger tracks and saw both fresh and old droppings everywhere. Noticing the spoor, he fixed his mind on his recitation while walking. At nightfall, when he was still in the middle of the forest, he heard 2 tigers growl. As they moved nearer, their roars became deafening. Suddenly, a tiger emerged on the trail, walking toward him. Ajahn Chop stopped, turned, and saw another tiger approaching from behind. Each moved to within 2 meters of him. They were the biggest tigers he had ever seen. Each of them looked as big as a horse, its head about 40 centimeters wide. Seeing no way out, Ajahn Chop stood motionless, his feet frozen, thinking this was to be the end of him. At that critical moment, mindfulness came to his rescue. Determined not to abandon sati even though he might be killed by the tigers, his mind withdrew from the tigers, dwelt within, and became one-pointed. Intuitively, Ajahn Chop then knew that the tigers could never kill him. In an instant, he was oblivious to the tigers, to his body, to his standing position, and to everything around him. His mind withdrew completely into a deep concentration and remained there for several hours. When he came out of his concentration, he found himself standing at the same spot, with the glot on one shoulder and the alms bowl in its sling across another shoulder, the lantern still in one hand, but the candle long since out. He lit another candle, but no tigers were to be seen. The forest was quiet. After emerging from his samadhi, Ajahn Chop was surprised that he was still in one piece, untouched by the tigers. His mind was filled with courage and compassion. He felt that he would be able to face hundreds of tigers now that he knew the power of the mind. He felt great love for those 2 tigers who were really friends in disguise, for having lifted him to the Dhamma and for helping him to realize its wonders. Ajahn Chop continued on his journey. Overjoyed by his discovery, he continued to meditate while walking. At about 9 a.m., he reached the edge of the forest. Approaching a small village, he put on his outer robe, set down his tudong gear, and began his alms round. The sight of a tudong monk coming out of the forest in the morning surprised the villagers. They knew that he must have spent the night there. Many came outside to offer him food and to inquire how he had managed to come through the great forest unharmed. The biographer concludes that it was the power of the Dhamma that enabled Ajahn Chop not only to survive his encounter with the tigers, but also to find his way through the forest. The following recollection illustrates how Tudong monks accepted tigers as a natural and inescapable part of their lives. Ajahn Chua and his fellow monks, Kao, Son, Puntan, and some lay practitioners stayed in the vicinity of tigers when they were practicing in Golden Pot Forest. They lived in stark simplicity. Ajahn Chua and Son built huts on rock outcrops, shelves of stone about 5 meters wide, over 20 meters long, and 15 meters high. Below their platforms, which stood parallel to each other like 2 stone walls, was a pond where wild animals came to find food and water. From his thatched hut on the rock platform, Ajahn Chua could see wild boars, elephants, tigers, barking deer, and bears. One afternoon, he saw at least 10 wild elephants by the pond and heard the rest of the herd breaking bamboo and young trees in the grove. It was not unusual to hear tigers howling or see them prowling by the huts. Quote, "One night the monks got together in a kuti to recite the Patimokkha. I heard tigers play fighting with each other by the rock near the hut. Judging from the noise, there must have been several of them. From the time the monks began to recite the Patimokkha until they finished, The tigers remained at the same spot, and the growling did not let up. Luang Pu Kao was so annoyed that he told them to shut up, though in an affectionate way. Quote, "Hey, you guys, stop being so loud. The monks are listening to the Dhamma. This is not a place to play. Listen to me or you'll all go to hell." They quieted down a bit, but still growled for a while longer. This incident confirms Ajahn Mun's teaching that, quote, "If you're terrified of tigers, be where the tigers are and make friends with them." It appears that Luang Pu Kao had succeeded in putting this advice into practice. The younger Tudong monks, however, were still learning from their experiences. In the forest, no hut was completely safe from animals. The monks had to live according to the laws of nature, and nature is unpredictable. They learned that the rule of survival was to always be mindful and alert for any surprise visit. Ajahn Juan remembers an occasion when, quote, Buntan, a fellow monk, was about to step out of his kuti and saw a big tiger sitting on the steps. He had to wait for quite a while until the tiger went away before he could get out of his hut. He also recalls the time when, quote, the monks saw and a novice had diarrhea. They ran to the latrine, but the novice got there first. The monk couldn't restrain his urge, so he went in the bush. As he was squatting, a tiger leapt over his head, which set every nerve in his body tingling. The tiger ran toward the latrine. Hearing the sound, the novice quickly fled. Luckily, the tiger ran off into the forest, and the boy didn't have to face it. Okay, so I'll just leave it there for today. And are there any questions that anyone would like to ask Ajahn Chunda, maybe? Yes. So actually, I do have a kind of a similar story. I did run into a Black Panther actually when I was living at a very remote monastery in Thailand, and that particular that Black Panther was not very large, but still it was large enough to be quite dangerous, and that was really the first big cat that I had ever run into. So it was quite an interesting experience for me. That particular experience, I felt like, it was during the middle of the day, and I just kind of came around a corner, and this Black Panther was right next to a stream, and it was quite startled, and I think it took it a little while to figure out what I was. And so when I finally saw it, it was quite close to me, and it was crouched on the ground, like ready to jump on me, actually really shaking a lot. And we just kind of stared at each other for a few seconds, and in that particular experience, I didn't really have much fear arise, because I think I had this confidence living in the forest for a long time that big cats and just animals in general just don't really attack humans unless you give them a reason to. And I felt it is quite an interesting experience, because we just kind of stood there and stared at each other for about 5 seconds or so, and just looking into its face, it was incredibly intimidating stare that it gave me, this incredibly powerful and aggressive stare that it was giving me. But I really felt like as long as I didn't run, and as long as I didn't act aggressively towards it, and I didn't give it some kind of reason to attack me, I just had this kind of confidence that it wasn't going to attack me. And after we kind of stared at each other for a few seconds, and then I had this sense that if I kept staring at it in the eyes, that it was going to take it as a challenge, because I could just kind of see from its face that it was very kind of proud and aggressive. And so at that point, I just kind of looked down at the ground for a moment, and then when I looked up, it had turned around and was just kind of jogging away, and it leapt up to leapt up the side of a nearby cliff, and also to say, like, in that particular situation, I was just kind of more in a state of shock afterwards, so I didn't really have that much fear. But that being said, I also did have the experience, living in that place, which is really like a real jungle. It's in a national park, so it is still a jungle where there are tigers and all kinds of large animals living there. And so I did have the experience, kind of like what was being described in the reading, as like at night sometimes hearing an animal nearby and being afraid that it was a tiger. And I had a number of times where, because there you really are like sleeping out in the open, it's very much like trying to replicate this the lifestyle of the Kruba Ajahns that I was just reading about. And I did have this experience a number of times, waking up in the middle of the night and hearing a large animal nearby, and being just sleeping just out in the open, just on a platform, and just real terror, extreme fear arising, some of the strongest fear that I've ever experienced. And there have been monks who have seen actual tigers there before. I think even fairly recently. So that's definitely in the back of your mind. And it's also extremely remote. It would take about it's about a 4-hour drive through the jungle in order to reach that place. And there's usually only a few people or a handful of monks living there at any one time. So you really feel like you're completely alone and you're completely out in the jungle. And if something attacks you, it's basically you're not going to be able to call an ambulance or something, or call for help. So this monastery, which is called Daodam, is it's a very interesting place. In the old days when it first started, there used to be like a village that was quite close to the area where the monks live. Even though it's very remote, there used to be a very remote village there. So the monks used to go for alms to that place. But now, for many years, that village has been gone. So there's no one living really around that area. So all of the food actually has to be driven into the monastery, and it's kind of like a branch monastery of Wat Nanachat, the international monastery in Thailand. So it's supported by supporters of Wat Nanachat, and there's a kind of a group of people who will regularly come in, every few weeks or so, and bring food that can be stored there. And then usually there will be maybe one or two lay people who will live in the monastery and will do the cooking. It's really the road there as well is extremely rugged nowadays, and you need like really heavy duty truck to get in there. So there are these supporters who have like off-road really big trucks, and they really enjoy driving in there, and it's quite an adventure. I spent about a year living there. Thanks. That's a good point, because that was one thing I almost said actually before beginning reading these stories. I've always found them incredibly inspiring, but it's also important to keep in mind that we might not be ready for all of these kinds of practices. So it's not necessarily something that we should try to really emulate, at least right now. A lot of the practices, like, really facing a tiger or something, is quite an advanced spiritual practice. And I think, for myself, like, it seems like, like you're saying, we should kind of start with something that is a bit less frightening than a tiger, and it's kind of like, working your way up to that. So if we're not able to be present with a small amount of fear, then I feel like it's probably not appropriate to be putting ourselves in really terrifying situations. So I mean, I think it depends on the particular person. It's just like, what are we afraid of? For myself, I've always been quite terrified of public speaking. So, for me, like, the microphone is kind of like my tiger. So, and I think actually I'm probably more afraid of public speaking than I am of a tiger. So, for me personally, it's like, if I want to push myself in terms of working with fear, then having to be in situations where I have to do a lot of speaking, or I have to like meet with people, I have to speak to groups of people. For me, that's really like a great practice. But I think it just depends on you personally. You have to see for yourself. What is it that you're afraid of, and we should be able to see that just kind of naturally as we live our day. Are there certain there's certain situations that we're afraid of, and if there are, then is there a way that we can just find situations that bring up that fear, but in small ways. Like, for example, like, if you're afraid of public speaking, then instead of going to give a speech in front of thousands of people or something at a stadium, it's like, can you just start with like speaking to a group of 5 people or something? So like, it brings up the same fear, but it's on a much different level. I mean, in my own experience, I guess that there is, there are kind of different kinds of fear. And I mean, certainly, in the times when I felt like there might be a tiger close by, then, that fear, it did have kind of a slightly different quality to it. It's like, kind of like you're describing in the readings, this like icy cold fear that kind of like goes into your bones or something, and it's quite sickening. But I mean, my sense and my experience is, it's like, I do think it's the same. It's like the difference is kind of superficial, or the difference is just like on the surface. They're slight. It's kind of like differences in anger or something. I don't know. There's rage and irritation, but they're basically they're all kind of the same, or the way that we deal with them should be the same.
I think for my personal practice, the fear and her question about bodily fear, or just fear of like speaking in public. But I feel like all those fears is like the self, which doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. So by getting through the fear, we're also eliminating that sense of self.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, that's very much like, reading these stories, a lot of the ways that they ultimately were able to overcome those really extreme fears is just like, by letting go of their attachment to their life, letting go of their attachment to themselves. So I mean, that's certainly the root of our fear. But it's also kind of like with all of our defilements, we can work at it from different angles. So there's the practice of samatha is just learning how to be present with the fear without being so shaken by it. But then, like you're saying, we can use vipassana to actually investigate our sense of self, investigating the body. And if one did have some kind of deep insight into not self, then certainly that would also overcome the fear as well. Okay, thank you.